discuss how far we've come and the road forward with Professor Salim Abdul Karim. Of course, he's an epidemiologist you will know well from our updates on COVID-19, but the main body of his work has been around HIV. He's head of CAPRISA, the Centre for the AIDS Programme of Research in South Africa. Prof, always great to chat to you, and really important that we speak to you on World AIDS Day. We certainly have come a long way, but what for you is the main challenge that we still face on AIDS?
Good evening, Sally, and good evening to all of your viewers. When I look at the global situation, we have seen how over the last decade we have increased the number of people on treatment. It has been nothing short of amazing to look at that progress. However, when we look at prevention, we are sadly lacking. There were 1.7 million new infections last year in the world, about the same the previous year, and about the same the year before. We are simply not making enough progress on prevention. And Africa, which has 70% of all HIV infections, and South Africa, that has 1/5 of the global burden. 1 out of every 5 people living with HIV is here in South Africa. And we have high rates of HIV still continuing, predominantly in young women. And that remains for us a major challenge that we have not yet been able to solve.
Is that because it's a societal issue and the high levels of, for example, gender-based violence, which our Deputy President has actually spoken about, is that it's not a quick fix? We do know that there are preventative medicines that you can take to prevent you getting HIV. But so many of these young girls and women who are in abusive relationships or are simply attacked have no say, have no control over what happens to them.
It's true. When we look at the challenge in young women, we are facing what I would call a perfect storm, because you have behavioral issues at the one end, you have biological problems on the other, you have societal problems. And so all of these combine. And what you've been talking about in terms of gender-based violence is one of the big challenges we face at a societal level. At a behavioral level, one of our biggest challenges is to try and break the cycle of HIV transmission, which is driven by age-disparate sex. That these young girls are becoming infected because they're having sexual relations with men that are on average about 10 years older. In other words, men in their late 20s and early 30s. So that age disparity is a big challenge to us, and if we can address that, we would go quite a far way in terms of making an impact. And then finally, we now have a better understanding that women, young ones in particular, have a biological risk, and it relates to the way in which their genital tract, that when they're young, they have something called genital inflammation. What they have is these CD4 cells that come up and come close to the surface in their vagina. So when they are exposed, they have a very high risk of infection. So it's biology, it's behavior, it's what's going on in society, all of these things combined. It's not one single solution. We need to tackle this problem in a multi-pronged way.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that young girls have a biological higher risk because of the developing vagina. So up until what age are girls at risk or at a higher risk biologically?
So what we find is that a very wide range of women, around 30 to 40% of women, have a disturbance in what is called the microbiome of the genital tract, of the vagina. The microbiome is the organisms that live in the vagina. So naturally, there are several thousands of species of bacteria. There are millions of bacteria that are in the vagina, as you have in the mouth, in the gut, and everywhere else in your body. But when there's an imbalance, what happens is that the wrong microbes, the wrong bacteria grow. And when those grow, for example, a bacterium called Prevotella bivia, when that grows, it causes an inflammation. It causes the vagina to lead to a situation where it calls immune cells. And those are exactly the immune cells that HIV is looking for. HIV will only infect cells that have the CD4 receptor. And it's this imbalance that's causing this problem. As you get older, that imbalance becomes less and less common. But it remains a problem well into women in their 40s. So dealing with this imbalance is one of the challenges we grapple with.
And it's just a sign of how much more we know about HIV/AIDS over 30 years on. What for you is going to be the next big medical breakthrough? As you've explained, dealing with a lot of the societal issues that contribute to no dropping of infection rates is a much harder one to tackle. But what is the next big medical breakthrough that you're expecting? Is it the vaccine or is it something else?
So if you asked me 5 years ago, what's the prospect of a vaccine, I would have said, not looking very good. That horizon is a bit gray. But today, I am of a very different opinion. I am much more optimistic about a vaccine. And the reason I'm optimistic is because, see, in HIV, there's a lot of variability, right? We call it genetic diversity. This virus changes itself all the time, and we have every different kind of HIV. So when you make an antibody against HIV, it'll only kill this HIV, but won't kill the others. Well, a few years ago, there was a discovery that you get broadly neutralizing antibodies. These are very special antibodies, and only a handful of people make these antibodies naturally. So when you can find one of those broadly neutralizing antibodies, and you can manufacture it and inject it into people, you can now protect, in animal studies, you can protect animals from getting a monkey form of HIV. So now we're doing that in humans. And in humans, we've got a whole range of these broadly neutralizing antibodies. And I'm very optimistic that one of them is going to be big news and that it's going to protect. And in South Africa, researchers from South Africa, from CAPRISA, from the National Institute of Communicable Diseases and UCT, together with the US NIH Vaccine Research Center, we've manufactured an antibody that is being tested here in South Africa. So I'm optimistic that that's where we're going to see the next breakthrough, because once we have a broadly neutralizing antibody that can protect, it becomes a pathway for us to eventually develop a vaccine.
That's potentially really exciting news. I cannot let you go without asking you to put on your COVID-19 cap. Professor, we're so concerned about what's going on in the Eastern Cape and in the Western Cape. I spoke to the mayor of George a little earlier in the program, and they're trying to, they've cancelled sporting events. But I'm just wondering what your view is on the best way forward for what's going on in those two provinces. There is talk of a localized lockdown. Do you believe that is something that really strongly needs to be considered now?
I've been following the situation in the Eastern Cape for quite a while, of course, and I do so on a daily basis. The situation there is indeed worrying, not just because the number of infections are going up, but because it is overwhelming and putting a lot of pressure on the healthcare service. At the moment, the healthcare service is just about coping. But what for me becomes the fundamental issue is that we, under level 1, have a whole range of restrictions that, if applied properly, can control the spread of this virus. Let me give a simple example. We say that you cannot have an indoor gathering of more than 250 people. You cannot break the curfew, which operates from midnight to, I think, 4 a.m. in the morning. The problem is that in the Eastern Cape, we seem to have a fair number of establishments, particularly alcohol-serving establishments, that routinely break these rules. They can accommodate thousands of people, up to 1,000, 1,500 people at a time. No social distancing, no masks, and it just takes 1 or 2 people with the infection in that setting, and you've got a few hundred cases. And once that happens, it then spreads in the community. So what I'm saying is that we need to use the tools we have now, the voluntary tools and the compulsory tools, and we've got to enforce them. Before we start talking about putting in more restrictions, if we can't get people to follow the restrictions we currently have in place, to me, why would we want to put more restrictions that people won't follow? Let's get people to follow the restrictions we have now. And if they do so, I'm pretty confident we can bring these epidemics under better control.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us. Always a pleasure. That was Professor Salim Abdul Karim. He's head of CAPRISA. That's the Centre for the AIDS Programme of Research in South Africa.